there was a movement that was built that brought together different segments of the social movement world. Immigrant rights groups were talking to labor organizations, they were talking to civil rights groups, education justice groups started to talk to each other, they were coordinating with educators. And so if we fast forward to last year, we see that we now live in a very different state. And this did not happen just simply as a result of demographic change. This resulted because people of color, including many students and many educators, worked to educate voters, to organize on local levels, and to increase political consciousness about the root causes of problems in our communities. So here's a picture from last year where young people of various racial backgrounds, LGBTQ identified youth, were fighting to free our dreams. So one thing I want to remind you of, and I think we know this intuitively, I think you know this as educators, that when young people learn how to engage civically in their community, when they learn to understand the root causes of problems in their community as adolescents, or maybe even as junior high students, they become lifelong advocates for social change. This was true of the people in the civil rights movement. And oftentimes, our students don't realize that the civil rights movement was a student-led movement. Yes, we did have important leaders like Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. We also had prominent leaders in the farm workers movement, but the foot soldiers of the civil rights movement were young people. These young people who were involved in earlier movements then became the mentors of later movements. I remember in the 90s meeting Black Panthers, meeting people who fought alongside Cesar Chavez for farm workers' rights, and they were training us to be advocates for social change. Now the people who were fighting Prop 187 and other propositions are training the next generation. The work that you do with your students is going to have an impact now as well as in the future. You've got to remember that, because the social consciousness that you help develop among these young people, among your students, it's really going to has the potential to transform their lives and the communities around them. Now, I want to remind you that you don't need to do this work alone. There's community organizations out there who might be able to support you in bringing political education, civics education into the classroom. I'm just going to give you an example of one, but there are many, especially here in the state of California and here locally in Los Angeles. So in the last election cycle, a group of youth organizing groups and traditional voter mobilization groups got together and formed this coalition called Why Vote. And they sought to educate both high school students and young adults about the importance of the elections, the importance of getting involved in their communities. One of the slogans that they used, or hashtags that they used, was "I'm 1,000 votes." And I thought this was a pretty powerful hashtag, in part because it represented the power of adolescents who weren't quite yet old enough to vote, as well as undocumented youth, to mobilize many voters on their behalf. And since there's many people here from LA, I want to give a plug for the LA Youth Vote, which is a group that is raising civic awareness at local high schools and even some middle schools to help people understand the importance of voting and what it means beyond the presidential election. It's helping young people understand voting rights, helping understand why it's important to understand what's going on locally as well as statewide, and it highlights the importance of voting, but also engaging in more broader social justice community change. So they're available to register students at your high school school, do pre-registration, also train your students to train their peers. So I was given permission to share Minor Godoy's contact information. He's coordinating an army of young people in doing the civics education. His email is minor@Movement Strategy Center. So this is one resource that's available to you. So I want to close by challenging you to work with your students to envision what just schools look like, what a just society looks like. And you can remind them that positive social change is possible. It does take a little bit of time, or maybe it could take a decade or two to see very dramatic changes. But in the short term, we do see some important youth-led victories, and I know some of you heard about them earlier today. So I think it's possible to challenge our students to think beyond, to envision a new world, a new country, a new state, a new community, or different types of schools where we think beyond the partisan divide, and we start thinking about helping our students think about how to create a world where we realize that we are all interconnected across difference. And we can help them think about how we can better take care of each other regardless of our race, class, gender, background, our sexual orientation, and take better care of our Mother Earth. Thank you.
So, good afternoon, good afternoon. First, let me thank, I'm probably loud, huh? First, let me say thank John and all the folks at CenterX for organizing today. I've only had a chance to be part of a little bit, but I can tell from the energy in the room and from what I've heard from people that it's been a good morning. And I want to particularly say that for those of you who are teachers, how many of you are teachers that are here today? You know, to come out on a Saturday shows a lot of commitment to your work, so thanks for being here. I also want to just say it's great to be with Veronica, who I haven't seen in many years, and see the work she's doing, and just it's a real honor to share the stage with her. So I want to briefly talk a little bit about the kind of the moment we're in, the Trump moment, and like Veronica, put it in historical perspective. And I think that as bad as it might seem, it's important to realize that before he got elected, it wasn't like things were great. Okay. We had rising inequality, we had mass incarceration, we had some of the highest poverty rates amongst wealthy nations in the world before Trump got elected. Right? So it's a mistake to think, wow, Trump got elected, now everything's gone bad. It was already bad. Now, certainly he could make it much worse. But again, like Veronica, I want to remind you that I lived through the Reagan era. And when Ronald Reagan got elected in 1980, we saw the war on crime, the war on drugs, war on Central America, war on everything under Reagan. We had Edwin Meese as Attorney General, who was one of the biggest violators of civil rights this country's seen. During the Reagan period, the anti-apartheid movement took off. And what was important about that, it was led by students, but it wasn't just students. It was unionists, it was people in religious organizations. It was a mass movement that actually brought about Reagan's first defeat. Because Reagan was an ally, and the United States was an ally of the South African government. They were determined to keep the apartheid government in power. His first defeat in Congress was when the Congress voted for sanctions against his veto, overrode his veto. And it was students in this country and others who played a major role based on the inspiration of what was happening in South Africa in bringing that about. When that movement started, it was impossible to imagine that Nelson Mandela would ever be free. He was still in solitary confinement. It was impossible to imagine that government would ever fall because Frederick de Klerk decided he would give up power instead of causing a bloodbath. none of us could have imagined those events. And while South Africa is still not the country I would like it to be, the fact is change does happen. And when people organize, change can happen. And so I think we should, again, realize that yes, this is a bleak moment, but it doesn't mean that there aren't possibilities to not just resist, but to challenge the directions going in. One of the things I worry about is that sometimes I think we get distracted by Trump, right? Because he's doing a lot to distract us. But the real damage being done by this administration is the people he's appointed, right? And in their policies. Today is Earth Day, Science Day. Global warming is real, right? We know this. We are led by climate change deniers. The damage that will do to our future is, it's hard to even measure. So I think it's important to keep it all in perspective, right? Even as we think about what's possible. And what is the responsibility of educators at this moment. And when I use educators, I think all of us who are in education have responsibility. I want to recommend an old book by Neil Postman called Teaching as a Subversive Activity, written in the 70s. And Postman wrote it mostly to talk about the importance of education serving as a way to enable students to critique their circumstances, right? Because he understood, and it's as true then as it is now, that a big part of living in this country is to come to accept what should be unacceptable. Think about the way we've come to tolerate homelessness in Los Angeles. Right? We literally tolerate hordes of people living on our streets, many of whom are mentally ill. Right? Think about the way we've come to accept mass incarceration as simply an inevitable part of our lives, even though the numbers have just mushroomed over the last 30 years. Part of what Postman was calling for was for educators to recognize that it's their responsibility to make sure our kids don't accept it, that they understand what's being done to them, that they critique it, right? And that they're able to understand that as human beings, as citizens, as people, they have a right to resist it, to challenge it, right? And that an education that doesn't do that is an education that's actually complicit in the preservation of these oppressive conditions. So my question to you is, what are you doing with the power you have in your classrooms? I realized it as a brand new teacher, that when that door closed, I had power. I thought it was crazy. I said, I'm only 20 years old, and they give me all this power, right? But I appreciated it, because I realized that I had the ability, because I was teaching American history, to not only make my kids understand the importance of history, but to expose them to the contradictions of American history, and to make them upset by those contradictions. I think if more people were upset, if more of our American people had the ability to understand what's the difference between fake news and real news, right? If they had understood what it means to vote, right, and to exercise that vote responsibly, we would be in a very different place than we are right now. And so as educators, I think this is our time. But our responsibility goes beyond what we can do in our classroom. It also, I think, extends to what our responsibilities as people in this society, as citizens, as voters. And I would say that one of the things that troubles me, I often wonder, and it came up in the last panel, is why do teachers so often position themselves in opposition to their students? Why, we talk about a school to prison pipeline, right? A pipeline that may be a metaphor, but we see the consequences. We know that those we serve least well are the ones most likely to end up incarcerated. We know that in the name of security and order, we disproportionately punish the kids with the greatest needs. And we know that often that punishment starts in the classroom. And what I often wonder is why people who enter the profession to make a difference end up becoming complicit in a process that relegates kids to a life on the margins. And so one of the things I want you to ask is, what are you going to do with the responsibility and the power you have as an educator? In your classrooms, in your schools, will you speak out for kids who don't have a voice? right? For parents who might be afraid because of their status. Will you see yourself in solidarity with the communities you serve? Or will you be more focused on protecting your job? I often wonder, we don't get paid well enough in education to be worried about the job, right? but I see so many people acting in fear and not willing to risk their necks. I sat on the panel with Vitelli, it was so impressive to see the actions he took, to challenge the district when he saw his students being randomly wanded and subject to the most demeaning forms of abuse in the name of security. When you see your children's rights being violated, you have a responsibility to advocate for them, to be their voice. And I think if we did more of that, things would be a lot different. I think the rights go beyond that. And I think it also means that we've got to be more engaged politically. And I know that this might sound really hard, but we've got to talk to people who don't agree with us, right? They're the people who shouldn't have voted for Trump, because it wasn't in their interest, right? And those people, that map might look good, the one Veronica painted, but guess what? All you have to do is leave LA, and you are in almost Trump country, okay? You drive through the Central Valley, and you'll still see the Trump signs up, right? And you go into rural areas anywhere across America, and you'll see people whose lives are hard who still voted for this person, right? and what it says is that we've got to get better at talking to people who don't see the world we do. Because guess what? They're not watching the news we watch, right? They're not listening to the same shows. They're getting information from somewhere else. So we can't engage in dialogue with them, right? And it is about dialogue, not simply telling them what to think, right? Then we're going to keep losing, right? Because they've defined their interest in a way that is actually at odds with their own interest. And certainly at odds with our collective interest, as I see it. And so the challenge, I think, is how do we speak to people who don't see the world like we do? How do we recognize our commonalities, despite the differences in race and language and culture? And some people might say, well, that's not my job, let's leave the white folks to do that. Well, guess what? If some of us don't do it, you're going to still see this country doing things that are injurious to all of us, particularly people of color. And so I think that's a responsibility we've got to take on as well. Lastly, I think we've got to always ask